Over to you, Saloni.
Hello. Sorry, I just switched off my fan, which is why you probably saw me disappearing. So hopefully it's not too noisy and you can hear me nicely and clearly. So I have a terrible honking cold. It is luckily not COVID, but I don't recommend any summer colds. So if I kind of doze off in the middle, you know why. But I wanted to tell you about some work that I've been carrying out in my lab over the last 2 or 3 years. And one of the I guess I would define myself as a developmental cognitive neuroscientist. And so in general, I tell people that I like to put kids in scanners and find out what's different about their brains. Of course, over the last 2 years, because of a certain virus, it's been incredibly difficult to do anything like that. So a lot of my research has kind of pivoted to being online, and I've been trying to use particularly Gorilla to kind of deliver and ask interesting new questions that didn't necessarily involve putting children in scanners. Today I'm going to be talking to you about the role of reward in adolescent word learning. So I guess I want to start off by making a pitch, given that this is a fairly diverse audience, in terms of why vocabulary is important. One reason is that we constantly encounter and learn new words through our lives. Brexit, you probably didn't really know about Brexit pre-2015. COVID, definitely didn't know about that pre-2020. Cronut, we kind of encounter these new words all the time. And we also know that children with reading and language disorders can struggle with word learning, particularly acquiring new phonological forms. And we know things like vocabulary knowledge are a predictor of school success and eventually also life achievement. So it seems that part of this process around kind of acquiring new words is really, really important. And lots of researchers focus on kind of different aspects of this problem. So most theories focus on how words are learned. So like, how do you assign a specific word to a specific object? But one of the things that I really care about and started to care about a lot in the last few years is why do we learn new words? Why do we inherently find this interesting, exciting? Why do we seek this out? And so I guess the question I'm going to be posing today is word learning intrinsically rewarding, because it's not that someone comes and gives you £5 every time you encounter a new word or you learn a new word. So is there something that is an intrinsic driver from us? If so, is word learning intrinsically rewarding for all groups? I'm going to be talking about one particular paradigm today, which is learning words in context. This is not the only paradigm that I've used, but in the interest of time, I thought it might be better to kind of keep things kind of limited to one paradigm that I could explain well. So this is a really, really classic psycholinguistic paradigm. It's been around since the 70s, and it's been used loads and loads of time. And the basic premise would be that we can learn the meaning of new words by the context that they occur in. So if I give you this sentence, few countries are now ruled by a Saich. Now, Saich is not a real word. I've made up this word. But the question is, like, you might be able to kind of guess maybe what the meaning of this word is. And if you see the next sentence, in the palace lives the king and the Saich, then you might have a much better guess. And if you're thinking Saich seems something like a queen, then you would be right. And there are lots of examples of how we do this sort of in the wild. And again, lots of people have been really interested in sort of the diversity of the sentence context that you use, the number of encounters that you need, and so on. But one of the really nice twists on this kind of paradigm, I think, came from one of my collaborators at NYU, Pablo Rupoles, who's now an assistant professor at NYU. What he showed is in those kind of paradigms, when you learn word meaning from context, this is associated with intrinsic reward. And he demonstrated this in multiple ways. So he showed this that in terms of people's behavioral ratings, they tended to say that learning these kind of words was more pleasurable relative to when they couldn't extract the meaning of words. People's brain activity and reward processing regions like the striatum was higher when you tended to successfully learn the meanings of these words, unlike and if you didn't. Importantly, also, like you can also think about the effect of medication. So Pablo did some really nice work looking at levodopa, which had kind of increased reward responses, and risperidone, which is kind of inhibit reward responses. And he was able to show that when you gave people levodopa, it kind of boosted their learning. When you gave people risperidone, it kind of decreased or what's the right word here, decrease their learning. But the other thing that's really, really important about this kind of experience of reward is that actually experiencing that reward seems to fuel word learning. So you get memory benefits from sort of encountering and enjoying learning a new word. So you're much more likely to remember that word. So Pablo had done a lot of this work in German. So all of his studies had been in German, and all of them had been with kind of neurotypical adults. But in my work, I was really interested in trying to kind of open this up and potentially look at people, children with dyslexia, etc. And obviously being in the UK, my studies are in English. So we did a sort of a couple of different studies to try and get a handle on kind of converting and building on some of Pablo's work. So the first study I want to kind of give you a preamble onto is just to sort of say, what is the influence of modality on these sort of effects? And so here, Pablo had done all of his work looking at people reading these kind of sentences, but we also know from the literature that actually when people listen to the same kind of sentences, they also kind of extract words in the same way, extract meanings in the same way. So we hypothesized that learning new words would be intrinsically rewarding in both reading conditions as well as listening conditions. And we sort of said that, yes, intrinsic reward will also be associated with memory benefits. Now, this is actually a project that undergrad students at Royal Holloway carried out in 2020, 2021. So this is obviously something they had to do online. And it was pretty amazing for us that Gorilla existed so that we could just go off and get this data. It was not a problem at all. So I want to tell you a little bit about the paradigm. So as I've kind of demonstrated to you, you have these kind of M+ sentences. So you sort of have sentences where you encounter a novel word at the end, and they're kind of paired up so you can extract the meaning for word. Generally, after people encounter these words, they would have to type in a guess about what they thought the word was. And they would also have to give us a number of ratings. So like how confident were they, how tired were they, and how much they enjoyed that particular sentence. Interestingly, we also had a really good control, which is M- sentences. So in these sentences, these are basically jumbled up sentences from another set of M+ sentences. But here you cannot extract the meaning of a new word. And this kind of is a really good experimental control for us. So you would have things like John needed a battery for his Bemble. The teacher wrote the date on the Bemble. So it's really kind of hard to extract a meaning for the word Bemble. We presented these paradigms in a kind of reading condition, a listening condition. We also had a reading and listening condition, which is sort of akin to kind of thinking about subtitles. And this was a longitudinal study in a really, really simple way, or a learning study, because 24 hours later, people had to complete a recognition task on these words. It's also not as easy as it looks over there, because what we actually did was we didn't present these words sequentially. So you would tend to get a block of sentences. So you would encounter 4 different words, and then you would kind of encounter the pair for those words a little bit later. So it wasn't as trivial as it looks like in my kind of schematic. But yeah, the main thing is we tested native English speaking adults, and I can say more about this, but just to keep it brief, 42 of them did the reading paradigm, 36 did the listening paradigm, and 34 did the reading and listening paradigm. And I think our goal was just to get to above 30 in all of these conditions. So we were fairly happy with these numbers. So what did we find? Well, so I want you to look at the kind of MP sentences, which are shown in blue over here. Enjoyment is on the x-axis and learning is on the y-axis. And what you can very clearly see is that when people report greater enjoyment, they're also showing greater learning in the MP case. And this isn't as much the case in the MM case, which is those kind of control sentences that I talked about. So in general, when you can successfully learn a new word, but not in kind of these experimental controls, you do rate things as being more pleasurable. I just wanted to overlay those same kind of curves one on top of the other. So this is only for the MP condition where you can extract the meaning of a new word. And I just wanted to show you how similar this was across the 3 conditions. So listening, reading, and listening. One of the other things I wanted to show you is that on that recognition task again, so this is memory rather than learning on day 1. And again, the more you enjoyed learning that word on day 1, the better you were at remembering it. And this was regardless of the condition, so listening, reading, or reading and listening. My very simple kind of takeaway from that work is just to say that actually intrinsic reward is associated with memory benefits. So we kind of replicated what Pablo had already shown, but kind of expanded it into these new modality conditions. So this we felt set us up really well. And in experiment 2, we decided to test in children. And we decided specifically that we were going to investigate change over development. The age group that we wanted to focus on was late adolescence. And this is because of some work from Lisa Knoll, which had suggested that when you train older adolescents on kind of relational reasoning and numerosity discrimination, older adolescents show the kind of greatest jump in performance. And adults and younger adolescents did show kind of learning, but they weren't as pronounced as the gains. So Lisa Knoll kind of suggested that late adolescence might offer a window of opportunity for educational interventions. There's also some work from the kind of neuroscience domain, which is kind of suggesting that striatal activity is predictive of later learning performance. And there's this general idea that increased reward sensitivity would lead to increased motivational salience, and then this recruits systems for learning. So actually, this would be a really important window. Late adolescents might offer a really important window for word learning as well. And so this is what we decided to test in this particular registered report, where we test 10 to 18-year-olds with the idea of basically, and this is, I should say, this is work conducted with RAs in my lab at the time, Amrita Bains, Annalise Barber, and Tam Nell. And the hypothesis we were looking at was that learning new words while reading will be intrinsically rewarding at an early developmental stage. When we did this work, this hypothesis hadn't been tested in children and adolescents, but the kind of premise of the fact that word learning would be rewarding, we would very much expect to see this early in development if truly reward is having meaningful interactions with language learning. We also hypothesized that intrinsic reward would be related to memory benefits, as I've just shown you in the previous experiment. But importantly, we had a developmental hypothesis that the kind of reward you experience and the kind of learning from reward would increase in age and would sort of peak in late adolescence, which we thought would be somewhere between kind of 14 to 16 or 16 to 18 years. So this is a registered report. So as you know, we kind of pre-registered the plans and we got reviewers. So this has been accepted in developmental science. And for this particular project, I'm reporting data from 345 native English speaking children aged 10 to 18. All of this data was collected during the pandemic. And basically our goal was to get above 84 children based on our pre-registration in all of these brackets. So we have 84 10 to 12-year-olds, 12 to 14-year-olds, 14 to 16, and 16 to 18. I want to show you a couple of kind of emerging results. I still need to finish writing this up and submit the stage 2 submission. So this is sort of work in progress, but some very, very clear messages so far from the data. The first is, like we saw with the behavioral study I just presented to you, learning new words is rewarding. So here we only did the reading condition, but just like before, you can see that particularly in the kind of M+ situation, when you kind of enjoy, when you report greater enjoyment, you tend to get greater learning. And you see some indication of this even in the M- condition in children aged 10 to 18. What was somewhat surprising, though, and what we weren't expecting to find is that there was no effect of age. And so in some ways, hypothesis 1, which is the fact that we would replicate this data in children, is kind of surprising, because if you had any experience of registered reports, what tends to happen is that you try to replicate a finding and it doesn't replicate. But actually, we did replicate the first finding, but we didn't find any evidence for our kind of second hypothesis. So it wasn't that 14 to 16-year-olds or 16 to 18-year-olds showed greater reward, greater sort of learning due to the word. Our kind of other registered hypothesis also we don't see really good evidence for. So we don't really observe memory benefits. And I think this is partially for 2 reasons. So basically what we would have expected to find is that enjoyment was predictive of kind of accuracy on the second day of learning. But one of the problems may have been that we made this task really easy. So for children, what we did is we didn't have the complicated blocking structure that I showed you in the previous experiment. We did give them sequential sentences because we thought it would be too much for children. And in doing so, what we may have done is actually make the learning demands of the task too easy and not being able to observe these kind of memory benefits. That's one idea potentially. So I wanted to kind of summarize what I've told you so far, in terms of the science. So children and adults do find word learning intrinsically, and we want to suggest that when tasks are challenging enough, that we find that reward is associated with greater memory. We're doing some future work on this. So we're now looking at the neural basis of reward for word learning in neurotypical children and children with dyslexia. And we're also starting to understand the processes of motivation going beyond the experience of reward alone. And this is work being carried out at Royal Holloway by my postdoc, Desi. But as Joe alluded to, I wanted to talk a little bit about what has BeOnline done for us. I wanted to mention some pros and some cons, and perhaps give you some very quick tips and tricks. So in terms of the pros, the reach of the experiment, like I mentioned that we tested something like 345 children for our experiment. There is no way we would have been able to do that based on kind of strict lab settings. It just would not have happened. I've alluded to the fact that this was possible in a pandemic multiple times. There was, again, no way that we could have gone into schools and got data in any other way. Designing these tasks was really, really easy. And so that ease of design, kind of getting undergraduate project students involved in doing this and so on, was really important. Sharing and collaboration was easier. My kind of collaborator was at NYU, but it was really easy to kind of just reach out to him and say, here's the paradigm, you can look at it, you can play with it, give me your comments. And of course, Gorilla's kind of open materials makes open science, kind of sharing and after data collection also much easier. I think there are some cons. While conducting this experiment online, we realized that we were at some point getting lots of bots, and that was problematic, or people who were just kind of picking up our ads online and doing stuff, and we didn't have a check for age in any way. So obviously, if you're testing a child in real life, you can see that they're a child. But one of the things that worried us were maybe people who were kind of participating and they were adults, but they were just pretending to be children to get vouchers from the experiment. Obviously, one of the things that you get when you are watching someone do your task is a lot of insight into participant behavior. We didn't quite have that. And we did have a tech problem in one of the experiments. So one of the particular tasks that we were using needed a keyboard response, but apparently lots of children nowadays use tablets to do everything. So they would come to this task and they would fail. And then basically we needed to set up multiple versions, including a whole new day 2 experiment, just in case they had failed this one particular chunk of the task. And of course, there is a bit more cost to running these things online than, so for example, if you run things in schools, you can just give people stickers. If it's online, you need to kind of tempt people with vouchers. Tips and tricks, we suggest lots and lots of experimental controls. We had in our experiment accuracy checks, attention checks. We kind of, as I alluded to, ran a new version of just the day 2 experiment. And I think the main thing that I would say is be responsive to participants, and ideally run studies in small batches so that you can chat and email with your participants and talk to them. That's all. Sorry for going over time, Joe. That's me done. Thank you.
That was fabulous, Saloni. Sorry, I was trying to unmute myself and failing to click the button. That was absolutely brilliant. I am so impressed with the work that you've done. I'm just going to have to change my view here because I can't bear looking at myself when I'm speaking. Gosh, that was a lot of kids that you recruited. Those are big samples.
Yeah.
How did you get them?
Oh, well, that was actually, we recruited even more than I presented here. So I think overall, we probably tested something like 540 kids. And then actually, because of the kind of experimental controls that you have, you drop people out, right? So lots and lots of kids. And I guess schools, like we send a lot of emails to schools to be like, please, can you put this up? And then lots of schools were very happy to be like, you're not asking us to devote any time. People can just go do it online on this particular link. That was great. What else did we do? Lots and lots of emails, lots and lots of social media kind of pressure on people. I mean, I think part of it is like when you do a registered report, you commit to doing the numbers. So you just have to get out and
you have to get out and get them. Yes. We're getting the last 5 harder than getting the first 5.
Actually, so we realized at some point that like the for some reason, we got lots of 16 to 18-year-olds, we got lots of 10-year-olds, but the kind of in-between group, the 12 to 14-year-olds, we had this little graph where we wanted to see the numbers going up, and for some reason, we just never got 12 to 14-year-olds. So getting those last few 12 to 14-year-olds was the most challenging bit. But yeah, it works out really beautifully. And yeah,
that's amazing.
I was really, really pleased with it.
I think there are some questions coming in the Q&A, and if you're in the audience and you've got a question, please do dump it in the Q&A now. One more question from me. What types of checks did you put in, sort of like sanity checks on your data, did you put in to make sure you're getting sensible data quality?
Yeah, so luckily this was a registered report. So like the reviewers also recommended a bunch of sanity checks. There are kind of one sanity check was part of our registered report, and we basically said that if we're really seeing children, and this probably also answers some of Matt Davis's questions in the Q&A, is that we would expect that kind of extracting meaning would be increasing with age, and we find a very, very strong relationship there. So basically, accuracy in the M+ condition very strongly goes up by age. So from when you're 10, you're a little bit worse at answering those questions. When you're 18, you're much better at answering those questions. And that is definitely what we would have expected. So that's kind of helpful. At some point, we hit this vein of people on Facebook who were like emailing us. And you know, seeing those emails is really reassuring, because there's a certain way a parent communicates, and you can definitely go, yes, that definitely feels like an interaction with a real parent. There are some where we were just not sure, and then we have kind of, a lot of them luckily failed our kind of attention checks. So we had stuff like we needed to have kids complete with a certain level of accuracy. We also had embedded attention checks in there. We've also got other controls. So we've asked people about their sleep, and we've asked people about kind of, we did this task with Jason Yeatman's group called ROAR. So we have ROAR data, and again, on the ROAR, we can see, which is a lexical decision task, for those of you who know what that means. You can again see that accuracy is increasing with age, and reaction time is kind of decreasing with age. So kind of good sanity checks in there.
Very, very cool. Yes, that sounds like a comprehensive set of sanity checks. Do you want to give a more comprehensive answer to Matt, or have you answered that sufficiently? The question was, do you think it's possible that the null effects of age could be explained by dishonest age reports? I think you've just about covered that. Is there anything more?
Yeah, I don't think it would be dishonest. I mean, I'm sure that like every single person in the data we can't necessarily verify. And one thing we should have really done is kind of possibly enforce a mechanism that people could only do the task once, because I was just like, oh, person with the same email who's done my task, like you can't be another person. Yeah. So there's a little bit of kind of sanity check, kind of weeding out stuff. But I'm sure if like someone was smarter and used like a second email, that's a bit harder to kind of disentangle.
Did you consider trying to get like and use the video recording zone just to get a screenshot of the person, or would you not have got that past the ethics?
I think ethics would have been challenging. I think a few people have been talking about like getting audio recordings during consent, because obviously your voice is a really good cue of your age. And if you say something like I consent, then obviously you know that, you know, it's a native English speaker who is
it gives you
but
quite
honestly,
a lot.
like, you know, I mean, I know you don't necessarily face some of these issues, but I would be inherently extremely surprised, and I'm sure we have a couple of these sort of things in the main data set, but I would be very surprised if that was the entire explanation.
Brilliant. Saloni, could you just go back to your slide of top tips, and while Saloni's doing that, Neil, could you get your slides ready for sharing in a minute? And what I just wanted to ask the audience that we've got here today, which of the tips and tricks was most useful for you today? What was the lesson you most needed to hear? Was it about learning lots of experimental controls and separating accuracy checks and attention checks? Or was it about needing to be responsive when things go wrong and maybe creating a different version of experiment? That was something you might not consider. Or was it the being responsive to participants? Or indeed the advice on recruiting children? Brilliant. Thank you so much. It's just wonderful. It's really great if you are willing to be generous to Saloni and give the feedback that's been most helpful to you, because it helps Saloni know she's done a good job. And it's difficult giving a talk to a room of completely blank screens, and that interaction from you guys is just really rewarding to know that we are helping you learn messages that are helpful, that you're going to take into your research and will make your lives better. Now with that, Saloni, thank you so much. You were wonderful. Thank you for starting us and setting the bar so high for everybody.